Hello, this is Arthur Bush. You're listening to Radio Free Flint. Today's guest is Professor Ben Pauli from Kettering University. Ben has wrote a book about the water crisis. Professor Pauli embedded himself with a group of Flint water activists during the Flint Water Crisis and discusses his experiences. More importantly, he discusses Flint's capability and capacity at activism and the consequences of the activism that he witnessed, and what the abilities are of the people of Flint to actually bring change. It's a very interesting conversation that we have about the future from a political scientist's point of view. I'm sure you'll be fascinated by the conversation and by Professor Pauli's conclusions about the people of Flint and its culture. So thank you for listening. Without any further ado, here's Professor Ben Pauli.
Ben, welcome to Radio Free Flint. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
How did you get in doing a book about the water crisis?
Well, firstly, it was affecting my family personally. I moved here, I should say, 15. At that time, there wasn't yet a water crisis. We hoped that there'd been some issues with water and making some tweaks at the and so we were not given the impression that there was any serious threat to families' health. And so we're determined to use Flint's tap water. We've always been believers in tap water. We had a 3-year-old son who was to some extent the ways coming water. So when we started there was lead in the water, and that was a couple of months of that was a concern for our family to take steps protecting our son as well as ourselves. But we could certainly identify who was going through this. People were just kind of struggling to understand what went on, figure out what to do about it on a personal level, but then also figure out what to do about it on a collective level. And that was the piece that really came to interest me, because once we had a filter installed on our faucet, we were more or less okay as a family, I started to realize that the crisis really exposed concerted effort of community members themselves, issues of water quality, detention, research, what was placing pressure on public officials to take the situation seriously and respond. That got me really intrigued on a couple of, firstly, just as a concerned resident and as a bit of an activist myself, I was curious to see this kind of social movement that was developing. But then the other part of it is that as a scholar, I'm interested in social movements in general, and particularly the use of ideas. And
Tell us about you.
so I was actually born in Madison, so I have Midwest roots, but I grew up in Washington State. My mom was out there. She's actually now the city of Washington, so she has quite in city government. My dad is a geologist.
From all the
Certainly, as I was writing it, I was aware that a crisis books, and of course, I hadn't read those books yet, print, so I was having to imagine a little bit what we're up to and to try to stake a claim to my own particular angle on the crisis. And really, I don't think I had to work terribly hard to figure out what that was, because, the whole reason why I ended up deciding the first place is that I ended up in a position this. I was a resident and parent who was worried about the safety, but I was a newcomer to the thing and still bringing a little bit of that outsider's perspective. I also had a foot in this world of water activism, maybe more than a foot. Ultimately, was pretty involved on the activist side, so I was getting to see the crisis. But then in April of 2016, I was also invited to a scientific team that was doing research into water quality issues. And so I had an opportunity to gain a kind of front row seat to some of the scientists. So bringing all of those perspectives together, I think resulted in a pretty advantage in what was happening. And that was part of what I was trying to accomplish, and it was to the crisis from a variety of angles, and to try to give people a pretty robust and rich analytic which to understand what happened. In the first few chapters of the book in particular is offer a number of different possible narratives, a number of different ways of telling the story of the crisis, no one of which is necessarily to the others. Bring out different elements, suggest different kinds of lessons that we might take away from the crisis. But the other thing I wanted to do is I really wanted to foreground the perspective of water activists in Flint. I wanted, their story really to be the heart of the story. And so their analysis of the crisis, the one that really gets the most attention in the book. And I also, to some extent, just tried to chronicle the various ways in which they responded to the crisis, drawing from their assessment of what its origins was, what its significance was, and what needed to be done in response to it.
Your book really takes a look at the water crisis activism, but it also morphs, at least by the end of this book, into an assessment of capability of collective action. And at one point in your book, you use the word Flint fights back. You describe your activity as fighting back collectively. The assessment of Flint's capability to fight back, at least with respect to the water crisis, was fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was frustrating me a little bit about the way in which the story was being represented, the story of the crisis was being represented after it became big national news, is that it tended to get boiled down to a few exceptional personalities who kind of came along at the right time and found each other, and they were each bringing different things to the table, and it was really their combined efforts that helped to break the story open and, force people to pay some attention to it. But, what I could see happening on the ground around me was rather more complicated than that. You don't usually get social change unless there's a larger scale mobilization on the part of people in a community like Flint. And that's exactly what we see when we go back and look, all the way to April of 2014, when the Flint River water started flowing through the pipes. People started raising concerns about that almost immediately, actually before even it happened. There was a steady drumbeat, really, of public concern and outcry, and ultimately organizing and activism that created the conditions under which any particular individual was able to have an effect. That really was the story that I wanted to help to tell in the book, was a story about all of these people whose names, you don't necessarily know, who haven't gotten the same kind of attention, awards, and accolades and credit and so forth, but who collectively came together and created the conditions under which the crisis finally got acknowledged, ultimately, at least to some extent, addressed.
As you covered that aspect of this, your experiences beforehand with working who had been involved in trying to be forward-looking about this charter, adopting a more modern approach to governance. You met many people that you said you, and then you had the opportunity to have a real bird's eye view about these people from your work with these actors themselves.
Certainly, yes. I mean, I think that, in Flint, there's a real kind of historical sensibility that people are operating with that's very striking. I mean, Flint, as you know, has a very rich history, and it's one that is still alive in respects. And there's a lot of pride that people take in aspects of that history, especially this tendency for Flint residents to band together and to stand up for themselves when they feel like they're being exploited or abused in some way. And it goes all the way back to, at the very least, the sit-down strike of 1936-37, this idea that even if we're David fighting Goliath, there are times when you've really got to put your foot down and stand up for what's right. And you don't necessarily weigh the odds of victory. You just throw yourself into that fight. And I think that it's that kind of scrappy mentality that we see as being very central to water activist culture, as I see it here.
Well, it's endemic to the culture itself, isn't it, of the people of Flint? This history that they have of battling the roller coaster, the American economy, played out, particularly the auto. They do have that, what you call scrappiness.
It certainly has. I mean, I think it's worth remembering that when these activists started going to officially sponsored meetings about the water, after officials were beginning to admit that there were some, not so insignificant issues with water quality, what they were told at those meetings was that there was absolutely no possibility of the city switching off of the Flint River. And so it wasn't even worth having a conversation about. And to some extent, you were betraying just how irrational and stubborn you were by even raising that as you, and just how unreasonable you were, because you weren't willing to have a serious conversation about what should be done with the water.
Your voice is obviously part of a choir of those who looked at this crisis and who have come to the same fork in the road. Some of those have been singer-songwriters, troubadours, who have wrote the history of this crisis in song. And one of those, Asche Dubicott, a German, who's based in Boston, wrote a beautiful song, Flint, Michigan. And the song talks about the gaslighting that was being done by those who were essentially, as the lyrics of her song goes, something putting sand in their eyes. Isn't the notion that don't believe your lying eyes, okay? Don't believe your taste. Don't believe your common sense. This water that you're drinking is really not what you believe it is, and you're unreasonable. I mean, that's really gaslighting. And
no, I think that's the right term. And in fact, it's a term that was used by multiple water activists talking to me about that experience. This is one of the reasons why the crisis dragged on for as long as it did.
So you have an administration that wants to tout their greatness and their wonderful, telling people that their water's not dirty, doing something sis, and you're looking at the truth. That has an impact on people who already have a culture of, as you referred to it, Flint fights back. Wasn't that kind of stuff just putting a red flag in front of a bull?
For sure. I mean, at least, again, that is a mentality that I have encountered quite a bit here in Flint, is this kind of indignation that people feel at being treated that way. When it happens to them, they don't just curl up into a ball and say, oh, sorry I bothered you, right? Instead, they start looking for some kind of workaround. I think that's what happened with these public meetings around water, is that, when people realized they weren't going to be taken seriously there, they didn't give up. They just turned to different kinds of tactics. It wasn't trying to, convince people in positions of power to do the right thing so much as it was pressure and force them to do the right thing. And that meant mustering muscle. And that's something that Flint folks are good at doing.
Yeah, that goes back to the sit-down strikes when the bosses didn't want to meet their demands as we sat down inside. Even before that, they asked for reasonable things like bathroom breaks, the right to have a little eat where they work the winter, and more simple things like better hours working. The Flint people didn't take no for an answer, did they?
No, and I think that's the key, because again, if they had gone to these meetings and they'd taken for granted this idea that switching off of the river was a non-starter, and they would have put themselves at the mercy of people who were making decisions on the basis of cost, who were making decisions on the basis of convenience, who were not necessarily prioritizing what the people who were drinking the water wanted to prioritize, which was their health and the public health. Rendering that no, right, is a really important moment within any social movement, because it means to some extent not going to work within the confines of the system and the way it defines your issue and your reality. To some extent, residents had to go out and create this other reality by collecting their own evidence of what was going on and making sure that that was so compelling that people ultimately had to come round to their way of seeing things.
Now, you described the Flint culture that you observed inside of the water activism as being one of an activist culture that existed in the community as a whole. And you spoke of it in your book as being intensive localism. What do you mean by those descriptors?
What I've seen since I've lived in Flint, that we've got a lot of the main, community organizers and activists who are very, very active. And some of them are active around issues that I think of are of very broad significance. And to some extent, their activism is an issue-based activism, if I can put it that way. Most of what I see going on in the community is very much grounded in the kinds of needs and concerns that exist among Flint residents, and on addressing those needs and concerns. Again, that isn't necessarily true of every activist culture, but a lot of what I've seen here is very much focused on trying to make Flint the best place it can possibly be by focusing intensely on the issues that are going on right here within our own community.
The experiences which you had and which you're describing tell me that you've met the Flintstones.
I'd like to think I have. I mean, certainly some of the people I've worked with and gotten to know, and friends and comrades, have been here for, if not their whole lives, in every case, a very, very long time. I'm thinking about people like Claire McClinton, who was a union organizer, who is in some ways, although she doesn't always like being described this way, sort of the matriarch of our water active and pro-democracy activist community here. There are people like Claudia Perkins Milton, who was also involved with the union back in the day, and was really a pioneering figure as a Black woman within the union. It's folks like that who are bringing all of that history into the fight. When they take on an issue like water. It's not just water isn't their only point of reference. I mean, they have this whole rich history of organizing and activism that they're drawing from, and any number of issues that they've confronted over the years, and they're drawing from that knowledge and experience in doing what they do. So I've learned so much from them. That's been really one of the great kind of revelations of moving here to Flint and becoming a part of this community, is that it's been another opportunity to realize how much I have to learn from others.
Let me bring the focus back to the Flints. You write in your book, when you're describing what might have went better in Flint during the water crisis, if people had a more commonality of interest, to draw on a greater collective identity. Your book isn't throwing shade on Flint, it's just describing what was lacking with this particular group of actors dealing with the water crisis itself. But when you talk of being
well, and as Art would put it, you need a story of us, one of this anyway, in order to mobilize particular issues. You need to have a conception of we are, who are people.
That's something that doesn't be, to some extent, identity is a social construct that has to be created. So the way we tell our started determining how we're going to tackle struggle. And so I think having theory helps, and having people like Claudia have been involved for years to keep bringing that back in and kind of reminding us who we are.
When you look at a guy like Arturo Reyes III, he's not just...
That's right. Yeah, and Art himself who has spent a lot of time studying and organizing, got a degree from Harvard. I mean, he has been right at the kind of work for a long time. Aside from the of us in a community like this, I mean, they need the kinds of ideas and skills and capacity that folks like that provide. Sometimes we're tension involved in determining what particular story would be told and who's going to be at the center of it and what kinds of tactics utilize. I mean, it's a messy process. In chapter 8 of the last, part of what I wanted to try to capture was not only work that people were doing trying to make that happen, but also in the complication, some of the limitation of that work, because I wanted to tell a story that was honest and that was, a way for other people looking from the outside in.
One of the grassroots fighting the activism.
When you're talking about Flint Water Crisis, environmental justice struggle, often where there's some kind of pressing threat, a substance that is essential for life, whether that be water, air, whether that be the part of injected into the struggle, is that people really did feel like they were fighting for their lives, for the lives of children, for the future of this as a whole. Remember, Flint as a city that's been described at times as a city that's kind of barely hanging on to life. This was a fight, not only on an individual or family level, but really a fight of the community. I think that there was a lot in terms of the way people conceptualized the emergency manager phenomenon, really to that to some extent, because that was a sort of a hostile takeover of that had to dissolve the city, and emergency managers have the power. The precarious future, I think, was very much in those minds with their own toxic substance that could really kill them.
The culture that surrounds the will. Rachel Maddow was will.
Yeah, and nothing that we in a lot of industrial cities where to some extent people have had to themselves because the state has kind of collapsed. Local government is not able to do all of this that we associate with functioning government, whether that be keeping the parks mowed or the trash, fixing the sidewalks, to an extent, the absence that kind of need for a DIY mentality. But again, I think Flint, that combined with this other deeply embedded in Flint's history, going back to what we were saying before, where when we are facing some kind of threats to our well-being, we're not the kind of people who take that sitting down. We are the kind of people who stand up and fight back if the odds are against us.
Is that something that's different, unique? I mean, you use words intense local.
Yeah.
I've never heard this.
We set in some sense a model for other communities that are facing similar issues, because we know that other communities are in it.
Are you saying is that Flint's a parable? It's an object lesson for others?
That really has been a core theme of Flint's, again, going all the way back to the sit-down strike is what really jump-started the American labor movement as a whole. What happened here, it had this kind of wildfire-type effect. So spreading. I think that the rise and fall of, to some extent, it encapsulates the whole idea of the American, gone wrong. Constant the dynamic and almost exaggerate in ways that help us to understand what's going on in other communities as well. As part of universal history of the country as a almost like on the cutting edge of that. He's showing other countries where they're going.
A lot of people have wrote books. They've done documents about an analogy toward whatever about the.
I think this is a city that is full of life on the way toward recovery.
Let's talk about the people of Flint. Are they unrealistic?
Sometimes there are objectives set for themselves, the ideals that they're trying to, and this do everything oneself. And that's part of what I try, right? There are times that on making sure that we are the one liberating ourselves, solving our own problems, as noble as that is, meant that we didn't have all of the capacity to actually tackle at hand. Sometimes people were very much in of outside help, outside resources. That's a tricky thing to navigate. You're starting out with that kind of pride. How do you welcome resources that are going to help you realize what you're trying to accomplish without compromising your autonomy, without inviting other interests in that might clash with interests? That's a key set of, you're looking at insistence on self-governance, this idea that they know best, right for them, and that they ought to be in the driver's anytime a decision being made that directly impacts their personal lives. There's a lot about that is not only that people ought to be self-governing. True, just as a matter of fact, people often do have a better sense of how water is in their everyday lives than the quote-unquote expert, and how impacting their personal than an emergency manager does outside. Sometimes, popularly reactive, it's all about tearing down experts and, these kind of shadowy strings controlling the world that we live in. At its core, I think principles that are harder to argue with. Yeah, I saw it firsthand at the water. Remember, I'm coming as a science PhD that I had something to offer full analysis of the situation. And what I realized is that I was another body. It was nothing special in terms of how I would by others. It wasn't that we're waiting around for somebody with a fancy degree to come and explain the situation to them. They already felt like they had and you know what? They were right. They were way ahead of their analysis of what was going on. And that's why, again, I was saying earlier, I've learned so much. I've learned more from the people I've been working with, that's for sure.
You really essentially describe as a ragtag group, extraordinarily passionate. How does that fit in? These aren't just a group decided in government for people that want to hang on. These are people who are challenged the system of government goes back to the Boston Tea Party.
That's right. I think that we're talking about people, on one hand, we're very much made it on a new level by the threats the water pose themselves and their family members. We don't want to discount that part of it. A lot of people would argue who do active community organizing that if you don't have that strong element of self-interest, it's going to be hard to generate a lot of fire, sustain it over time. It was certainly about more than just that. Part of the indignation that people felt at having their water contaminated, it wasn't just what was being done to their own body and the body of their children. It was what was being done to their community. It was this idea of feeling like it didn't matter, that this is the kind of thing you could do to Flint and get away with it. Certainly on that level to fight back, not just on behalf of individually, but on behalf of as a whole. In terms of how that fits our larger national, these kinds of issues. Again, people in Flint, they were operating a kind of what democracy, how a democratic system should function, what that looked in practice. And a lot of standing up, trying to not only themselves live up to a certain set of principles, but to make sure that those in of power are doing, they fail to do that, then you take matters on hand. And it's in that sense that I think the social movement around water can potentially truly be a source of inspiration for other communities.
Ben, how do you think the Flintstones did in battling, all said and done?
Well, when you think of all of the things that probably have happened, people didn't mobilize the way they did. It's a fairly long list. Now, of course, it's always difficult to do counterfactuals to say what would have happened if we removed some variable. I don't know, sitting here talking about a Flint water crisis at all, if residents hadn't into their own hands and really been as determined as they were, expose what was going on and force people to acknowledge it. So I think that was really the first thing that they accomplished, was to get the crisis recognized as a crisis. Beyond that, when you think about the amount of resources that have come this way in response to the crisis, it's not insignificant. Flint has been the beneficiary of hundreds of millions of dollars that people have fought for and lobbied. It's important to recognize that those bills don't get passed, actively creating pressure around them. And so we had activists here that were very much involved in that effort. Right up to the present, we're trying to get all of our lead service lines out of the ground. We have activists who are on the front lines here who are working diligently to make sure that people don't get left behind. We have a big water crisis settlement now that's all, and again, it's people in the community who are going around making sure that understand that and are signed up for it and are getting that they deserve. All of that stuff, and we keep going down the list, is a product, a great extent, of residents themselves and the necessary pressure and bringing public attention to the issues. In that sense, I think it's been pretty cool have accomplished. Does that mean that every smoothly or that every opportunity was capitalized on the way? No, of course not, especially in a city like Flint, where we don't have a lot of capacity to begin with, to take on every issue. There were times when I think we probably would have done more as an active community if we'd had more people, if we'd had more money. When you look at just how sick the crisis came, not only Flint, but to the whole country, to the world, it has helped to inspire things outside of. Don't think that it would have happened to really that extent without the contribution people made.
What do you see as the outcome of the governance?
One thing that is of note is that we are placing more emphasis on treating water as a right people have, fundamental human rights. It's now recognized in our charter, in Declaration of Rights at the beginning, and there are a couple of that idea is embedded in certain policies around water. Flint has been very proactive, for example, during COVID, to suspend water shutoff. Hopefully that's something that future, but it's going to have to be something that residents fight for. It's one thing to have it in the charter, it's another charter to actually get followed. That isn't what we have here, is that we have this governing document that is consulted. For all of the knocks we've had over the past few years, there are a lot of going on here to have hope, to even be optimistic.
It's one of the reasons there's hope for it has.
I think that's right. Yeah. At the end of the day, is that people don't just run away from challenges. I've met some are never gonna. Flint is their home. They know that a lot about weather and that good work to be done here, and that there are good things happening at the time. I mean, we don't always get that side of it. In fact, we almost never get that side of, it's not like wallowing despair day in and day out. I mean, their lives and trying to make things happen and having little victories and having little setbacks in the way that in any other community, except, again, as you say here, that fighting is especially strong. And we've got a lot of, in the book, that's kind of where I did this. I definitely did not want to make it sound like it's easy for David to fight Goliath. That David is always on the right side of every issue because he's David. I mean, you again, without trying to turn it into some sort of caricature of the little guys and gals fighting the system. There's a lot more complexity to it than that.
Turpentine. Well, Flint River water tastes like turpentine. Oh, they lied about the water. Now people are sick and dying. Well, the water was brown, smelled like chlorine. Still, the city officials said the water was clean. People broke out in rashes, some were losing their hair. They complained to the mayor, but he just didn't care.